What sort of leadership do we, the Jewish people, need right now?
It's not just about putting forward a vision and having people follow you. It's about the ability to see people.
I'm Claire Sufrin, editor of Sources, a journal of Jewish ideas. Our latest issue features articles from leaders of synagogues and communal organizations, as well as experts in leadership training, all seeking to answer this prescient and urgent question.
When we stand for something, and what we stand for is rooted in Torah, we are more alive.
Leadership in times of disaster and destruction is measured by its ability to point toward a better future.
We really have to think of it as an activity, as something you do, not something you are.
Our authors share the wisdom and guidance today's leaders need to help their communities navigate these turbulent times. Read, reflect, and subscribe to our award-winning journal at sourcesjournal.org.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Identity Crisis, a show from the Shalom Hartman Institute creating better conversations about the essential questions facing contemporary Jewish life. I'm Yehuda Kurtzer. We're recording on Friday, January 24th, 2025. You might be excused as a supporter of Israel for paying the bulk of your attention on the release this past week of 3 more hostages by Hamas as part of the tenuous ceasefire agreement that has finally brought nearly 14 months of relentless war to a halt. It seems nothing short of miraculous to see those 3 women emerging from the darkness of their captivity through the terrifying ordeal of what looked like they're being paraded through a phalanx of masked Hamas fighters and into the rescue ambulances, ultimately collapsing into the arms of their mothers back in Israel. I cannot remember a mitzvah, a religious Jewish obligation, that has generated as much debate about and passion for its implementation than this past year's flurry of discussion about Pidyon Shvuyim, the redeeming of captives, and whether or not you ultimately agree with the cost that the Israeli government had to pay in releasing the number of Palestinian prisoners that they did. There is widespread immense relief in just seeing these women return home. There's immense optimism now that maybe more will be coming home soon. At least for me, there's also a feeling of respite about this pause in the war, may it last, and what it can mean for Israelis and Palestinians to begin rebuilding after all of this trauma. But you'd only be temporarily excused for paying all of your attention to that story and taking your eyes away from a burgeoning other set of catastrophes, the moral and existential ones that are taking place these days in the West Bank. The West Bank has been on fire throughout the war, and now it lingers as the last active front of this 5-front war, maybe the most problematic of all. This week, some of my Palestinian colleagues at Hartman posted images online from the West Bank on Facebook, and my heart sank as I saw them. They were billboards put up by settlers with threats to Palestinians that they are going to be driven out. There were other billboards welcoming back home some of the dangerous young Jewish people in their midst who have been detained by the military for inciting and committing acts of violence against their Palestinian neighbors. Now, the state of Israel has the moral right and the pronounced need to justify military action against Palestinian terror and paramilitary groups in the West Bank in appealing to its own self-defense. But sometimes that appeal and all that it costs for Palestinian civilians caught in the crossfire is too much to ask for. And certainly when it turns from a means of military control to a means of supremacy, especially when civilians use their protected class to commit extra-legal violence, it's more than any of us lovers or supporters of Israel should tolerate. Early in the war, I argued that even as we should support the legitimacy of Israel fighting a just war against Hamas, we should be vigilant about being accountable that it fights such a war justly. I argued then, in particular, that the escalating violence in the West Bank was the site for exactly that kind of moral risk and overreach. But it was hard for a lot of people to hear it then, in the face of Hamas attacks and the trauma of the moment. Today, however, it should be impossible for us to not look. The central premise justifying Israel's war against Hamas is that it is a war against Hamas and not a war against the Palestinian people. Well, where are we now? Now, the violence between Jews and Palestinians in the West Bank has a long and tragic history, and one place to start that conversation is by interrogating its roots in the Hebron Massacre of 1929, when groups of Palestinians unloaded horrific violence against their Jewish neighbors and disrupted decades of quiet in what had been a historically sleepy and peaceful city of coexistence. I suppose starting our investigation then, at that moment, could risk situating some of today's violence, that which is perpetuated by the State of Israel against Palestinians who are somewhat or wholly under its control, and that which is perpetuated extrajudicially by settlers against their neighbors or vice versa. That could risk making everything we see today the product of context, that word that gets so weaponized, so poisoned to sound like justification. That's not my goal. I'm not trying to get us to stop talking about the problems of the present by trying to locate them in the roots in their past. But it still can be a useful reminder that, like Zionism itself, any emerging violence in this unending conflict is new and old at the same time. And of all the places in the West Bank to consider the magnitude of this conflict and the endurance of the violence that it unrelentingly inflicts, the city of Hebron looms largest. I visited Hebron years ago, and when you go, and even though you will not want to look, you must see it, you'll come away feeling that Hebron represents Zionism's heart of darkness, the place where the moral corrosion that the occupation inflicts on the State of Israel, on top of the oppression with which it burdens Palestinians, threatens the legitimacy of the whole enterprise. Hebron has become a place where the most radical Jews on the planet rule the roost, aided and abetted by being protected by the Israeli military on the side of the powerful, even as I believe that their expression of Zionism is antithetical to the one that the State of Israel should embody. In central Hebron, near the Cave of the Patriarchs, which, pick one, either it towers over the city with its historical and religious importance, or it maybe haunts the city all at the same time as it houses the sacred site for two faiths intertwined at birth, yet killing each other now all the while. Right near the Cave of the Patriarchs, Shuhada Street lays bare, a street lined with Palestinian shops that have been shuttered since the wave of terror in the Second Intifada, where now Palestinians are forbidden to walk free, but settlers stride proudly down the middle. I have never wanted to go back to Hebron since that trip, and I have successfully avoided doing so. Maybe because of concern for my own self-preservation, maybe because as someone who wants to advocate for a kinder and gentler Zionism, it was something I just did not want to see again. Maybe I didn't want to feel the power of a mirror that was showing me the moral limits of my own commitments. A few weeks ago, before the ceasefire, I had the opportunity to interview Yardena Schwartz, the author of a new and important and exceedingly well-written and accessible book called Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. Yardena is an accomplished journalist, and this is her first book. She and I first met some years ago when the Hartman Institute convened a wonderful group of emerging stars in Jewish journalism for a year of serious study and fellowship towards strengthening this critical field at a time when we are all starved for good reporting and honest storytelling. Our conversation about her book ultimately was a bigger conversation about narratives in this conflict, and we started our conversation right here, in Hebron, in the recent present, which Yardena also uses to open her book, with a story similar to mine, walking through Hebron on a tour led by the organization Breaking the Silence, and feeling what many of us feel in seeing Hebron, a kind of despair that makes us not want to look.
I had the same reaction you did, and the way you described it as Zionism's heart of darkness, I think I phrased it a little differently, but the same idea. I felt as if, this monument to Judaism's ancient past had become this symbol of Israel's moral unraveling to me, which I had not seen up close before my eyes before going to Hebron on that tour. And like you, I also just completely stayed away from Hebron. It was just too difficult, too depressing. And even after moving to Israel 2 years after that tour in 2013 and reporting from across the West Bank, I never went to Hebron until I started writing this book in 2019. And the only reason I went back was because Yossi Klein Halevi, senior fellow at the Hartman Institute, good friend of yours, and also Claire, my editor, who Yossi introduced me to, thankfully. He met this family from Memphis, Tennessee, who had found this box of letters in their attic in Memphis when they were moving to a new home. And it was filled with letters written by their great uncle who had been murdered in this massacre in 1929 in Hebron. He had gone there in 1928 to study at what was then the most prestigious yeshiva in the Holy Land. And 1 year after moving there, he was killed in this massacre. And while they had known about this uncle and knew that he was killed in this massacre, they didn't know much about him, the massacre itself, what Hebron was like before the massacre, and his letters, hundreds of pages of them in this box that they didn't know existed, really painted this vivid portrait of what Hebron was and what was lost that day. And he described not only Hebron's biblical beauty, which is really difficult to see today, but also the relations between Jews and Muslims in Hebron that are really impossible to imagine now when you look at what Hebron is today. I mean, today it's the antithesis of peaceful coexistence, but then it was the heart of coexistence in Palestine, in British Mandate Palestine. It was a place where Jews felt safer than anywhere else. It was a place where Jews from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv would go and vacation to in the summer months. You know, today you would not see Tel Avivians vacationing in Hebron today. So that was
nor would you see people from Hebron vacationing in Tel Aviv.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So after Yossi introduced me to this family and they entrusted me with telling their story and the story of their uncle, David Shainberg, this young man who was murdered in the massacre, it just opened this much bigger story about Hebron's transformation from being that beacon of coexistence to its antithesis. And, you know, we'll talk about this, I think, later in the conversation, but that was really what this book was going to be about Hebron. And after October 7th, that focus primarily on Hebron changed as well. I mean, the book is still very much about Hebron and that transformation and what it is today versus what it was then, but it's also much, much more about the parallels between that massacre 1 century ago and the massacre 1 year ago.
15 months ago, yeah. I mean, one of the powerful things about the story that you tell about David Shainberg of blessed memory is that maybe it's because he's an American, maybe because he was young. There's a whole bunch of reasons for this, but there's such a kind of optimism and passion that flows out of his letters, the way you narrate his story. And the result is that in reading the book, you kind of feel as though 1929 could have been a moment of optimism, especially within this context of the relationship between Jews and Arabs in Hebron, and then the episode of the massacre, on which how many people are killed in the massacre in Hebron?
So the massacre in Hebron took the lives of 67 Jews, but the riots of which that massacre was a part killed 133 Jews across Palestine and wounded more than 400 others.
Right. So there's something that happens then in the narrative where the massacre not only has these massive consequences, but it seems to turn that possibility of an optimistic, pragmatic story into something different. And I guess the question I wanted to ask about that is what we gain and what we lose when we attribute so much causality to one particular moment, right? Do you think that had the 1929 massacres not taken place, we really would have seen a different story? Like there's something risky, from a historical standpoint at saying this is the moment that triggers the rest of the conflict. And there have been other historians who have tried to pinpoint different moments and different times. So what was it that you think that was so kind of seismic or consequential about that particular moment?
So I don't attribute this one day or this one massacre in Hebron to being, the turning point, but the causes of it, what led to it, the propaganda, disinformation, and the exploitation of Islam by the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule at the time, those forces that ignited that massacre and those forces that had not really been active before then, that is what I think was the turning point, and also what followed in the aftermath of that massacre. The transformation of Zionism the end, as you say, of like this, kind of optimism around peaceful coexistence. I mean, Zionism didn't just become strengthened and more militarized after the massacre, but also efforts like Brit Shalom, like efforts within the Jewish community in Palestine to form some kind of binational state or entity. I mean, state wasn't really a concept back then, but, efforts by people like Magnus and Henrietta Sold and others, those really just kind of died off after the massacre, because for the same reason that Jews in Palestine who had been in opposition to Zionism, like David Schoenberg himself, he was an anti-Zionist, like many others in Hebron. For the same reason that those people began to unite around Zionism, they also began to be very skeptical about the prospect of living in peace.
Yeah, it almost seems as though the way you tell the story, Zionism, as you argue in the book, until 1929 is still not a majority position held by world Jewry. But I think another example that you provide is, if I'm not mistaken, 30,000 Jews march in New York City. Is that right? After
35,000.
35,000 in support of settlement in Palestine, in support of the Jews who have been massacred, and it kind of it shifts the story. So what might have happened as the rise of this violence, of a kind of backing off, or Jews saying, I guess this project isn't worthwhile, actually reverses course. And then the historical arc that you're telling in the story introduces a more militant or passionate Zionism in the land of Israel, but also becomes the kind of point of origin for a more apocalyptic Islamic intransigence and fundamentalism that is born at this moment. So take us a little bit further. Beyond the 29 moment for Zionism, how would you tell the story? And it's in the book, but I'd love to, especially for folks who haven't read it yet, what did the next kind of 10, 15 years look like? We know the state gets declared in 47, but what are the steps along the way where this massacre leads to the domino effect that you're effectively describing in the book?
So I'll try to answer this briefly, because so many things happened in those next 10, 15 years. But in the immediate aftermath of the massacre and those week-long riots in Palestine, the British, who ruled Palestine at the time, set up this commission, this royal commission from London to come to Palestine to investigate the causes of the riots. And in 1930, that commission, the Shaw Commission, determined that the Mufti, the Grand Mufti, the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule, was not at fault, despite mountains of evidence that they had just heard in public testimony that his incitement had led to the massacre. Instead, they blamed it on this peaceful Jewish demonstration at the Western Wall, which was in protest against the British failure to protect Jews at the Western Wall from Muslim attacks, and the British failure to respond to this disinformation campaign led by the Mufti, which claimed that the Jews of Palestine were working to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild their ancient temple. That rumor, which we so often hear today from Hamas leaders and other Palestinians, began with the Mufti in 1928. And it was that disinformation campaign that led to the riots. And he was appointed by the British. So the British had every reason to pardon him and find in their conclusions that it wasn't his disinformation campaign, but actually this peaceful Jewish demonstration at the Western Wall, which fed into fears on the part of Arabs in Palestine of rising Jewish immigration. And so 1 year after the massacre, the British responded by limiting Jewish immigration, limiting Jewish land purchases, and those purchases, of course, were actually being done with many of the Arab leaders who were complaining to the British and complaining to their own people about, not the Mufti didn't sell land to Jews, but his own family did sell land to Jews and the Zionist movement itself. And so it was often these Arab leaders who were leading the charge against Zionism that were actually selling their land to Jews and then displacing the Palestinian Arabs who were living on that land, and then blaming the Jews who bought that land for their displacement when, they were being paid what would be worth millions of dollars today. They could have compensated those people with the money they were taking, but they didn't. And so the victim blaming that followed the massacre, that actually empowered the Mufti and the forces that he ignited, and he became even more powerful. And in 1936, after he led a rebellion against the British responded by completely abandoning the Balfour Declaration and the promise of a Jewish home in Palestine. They put even stricter limitations on Jewish immigration and land purchases against the backdrop of Nazi persecution. And so during the Holocaust, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees who fled and arrived in Palestine were sent back to Europe by the British or interned in internment camps in Palestine and in Cyprus. And, the Mufti, the British finally decided to arrest him only after his rebellion took the life of a British official. And then he fled Palestine and allied himself and his cause with Hitler and lived in Berlin in a Nazi-financed estate throughout World War II. When World War II ended, he was placed on the UN's list of Nazi war criminals because he had not only been the leader of the Arab branch of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, but he had actively recruited tens of thousands of Muslims to fight for the Nazis. He had also worked to convince various leaders within Europe, outside of his work with the Nazis, he worked to convince different European leaders to send their Jewish refugees, not to allow them to come to Palestine, but to send them to Poland, because he had seen the concentration camps himself. He knew that they would not leave Poland. So that takes us to 1945.
So I'll hold you there. But one of the things that you've then introduced, which we'll come back to when we talk a little bit about October 7th, is that not only does this change the balance of politics both on the Muslim side and on the Jewish side, but it also introduces the complexity of this third variable, which is how do the allegedly neutral parties see this conflict, and how significant the public narrative about what's actually taking place becomes in the world's imagination, which we still see post-October 7th, where there's not only a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, but there's also this kind of third weird conflict, which is the conflict as it's thought about by people in the West. That seems to emerge at this moment as well. I'm curious, though, as you're digging through, you're trying to not just tell the personal story of David Scheinberg, you're also trying to make a larger historical argument about the significance of this period. And that forces you to adjudicate among what I can imagine is complicated bodies of evidence in a conflict that is predicated on two totally competing narratives. So I'm curious how you did that to assess this is a credible piece of evidence from 1929. This is a biased piece of evidence from 1929. You have strong views on the failures of the Shaw Commission. What was your method, or what enabled you to kind of make those choices?
So as a journalist, I approached this story as I have every other story I've told. I was never coming at this with a theory or an idea I wanted to portray and just pick out facts and history that met that theory, but tell all of the facts as they were. And so in my portrayal of what happened in 1929, I'm also very, I don't hide the fact that there were activists, revisionists who were working to reclaim the Western Wall, which was owned by the Mufti and the Supreme Muslim Council. And actually Jews were trying to purchase the Western Wall from the Mufti and from Muslims who lived near the Western Wall. So, I didn't kind of nitpick the facts that I came across. I, told them as I found them. So absolutely, this is a conflict of narratives, but I don't see this as a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. I really see this as a conflict between Israel or the Jewish people and a radical Islamist interpretation of Islam. And you can see that with this war. It's not between Israel and Hamas or Israel and the Palestinians. It's between Israel and various actors across the Arab world, not just Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah, but, in Yemen with the Houthis. And, I think that is often lost on this other front that you mentioned, how the war is perceived in public consciousness. And I think that this idea that this is a war by Israel against the people of Palestine is a false narrative. I don't think it has ever been and shouldn't be, because I think that, from my research and my reporting, I found many Palestinians who do want to live in peace and who would be happy to have a two-state solution. And it's the leaders who have rejected peace every time it was offered to them, and every time Palestinian statehood was offered to them from 1937, which I forgot to mention in my timeline of what happened after. So, the Mufti rejected the first two-state solution in 1937 when it was offered by the British. There could have been a free Palestine for the last century. And, I think that so much of this conflict is told through facts that do not reflect reality. I'm not saying that they're not true, but things that are true are just completely ignored, like the role of religion, the role of this declaration of jihad in 1947 that followed the UN partition plan, which is what led to what Palestinians call the Nakba. But when the Nakba or the displacement of Palestinians is mentioned, even in, places like the New York Times or NPR, it's not mentioned at all what led to their displacement, which was this war that was declared as jihad originally by Arab leaders, particularly the Mufti, when the UN voted to partition Palestine into two independent states.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Nakba. I want to stay on this place of what it means to even try to write something dispassionate, right, about this conflict. I don't think anyone who tries has failed, but there is a professional disposition of trying to investigate the truth, but we are always going to wind up attributing more blame or more causality to one side or the other. But the Nakba in particular, I struggled with a little bit in the book because you don't spend a lot of time on it. It's maybe a couple of paragraphs about the Nakba. And I guess the hard part about that is, I guess I'm on the record, it almost seems as though there are aspects of the Nakba as perpetrated by Israel in 1947 and 1948 that feel like they take cues from what was done to the Jews in 1929. And it almost then feels like, what happens then if, they did this first and then we did it at scale, maybe not exactly the same exact crimes, maybe not quite as ruthless, but definitely more dramatic. I wonder what that does to trying to assess the moral significance of trying to find root causes of this. I don't know what your take is on that. Probably not a comfortable one.
Well, I really disagree with the comparison.
Great.
Because in 1929, unlike 1947, when Palestinians fought and declared war against the Jews of Palestine and carried out a widespread terror campaign across Palestine, when you compare it to 1929, that is then arguing that the riots were in response to Jewish violence. But they weren't. They were in response to Jews urging the British to protect them from Muslim attacks at the Western Wall, which was incited by a campaign of disinformation, which claimed that the Jews of Palestine were working to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild the ancient temple. And so I think that this idea that the Nakba was perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinians is false. I really don't agree with that. I think that it was a war. 1929 was not a war. It was a pogrom, at least in Hebron it was, but not just in Hebron, also in Sfat. It was a pogrom in Jerusalem where it originated. It was very much a pogrom. It wasn't as successful because the Haganah was active in Jerusalem. By the way, in Hebron, the Haganah had visited Hebron 2 days before the massacre took place, and the Jewish leaders of Hebron told them to leave because they said, our neighbors won't hurt us. We have such good relationships with our Arab neighbors. There won't be riots here because there hadn't been riots in Hebron when there had been riots in other places. They just hadn't reached Hebron because of those good relations. So again, it was that campaign of disinformation that broke through those relations and managed to convince Arabs in Hebron who had until then been friends with their Jewish neighbors that actually those Jewish neighbors sought to destroy not just Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, but also the Ibrahimi Mosque, which is how Arabs refer to Marat Machpelah, which was also off limits to Jews until 1967. For 700 years under Muslim rule, Jews could not enter Marat Machpelah. But yeah, so I agree with you. I don't think that anyone can write about this conflict dispassionately. Even someone who doesn't have skin in the game, I don't think can. And I, of course, do have skin in the game. I lived in Israel for 10 years. My husband's Israeli. My children are Israeli. I'm Jewish. So but as a journalist, like I said, I do really seek to do the job of journalism, which is truth-seeking and truth-telling. And, that means that if I find, a fact or a piece of history or an archival newspaper article that has a bit of information that doesn't jive with whatever I thought, I'm going to include that, because getting across my point is not what I'm going for. It's getting out to the truth.
So when we go back to where kind of the book starts and where in some ways you ultimately get to in the book and even where it ends, in terms of the kind of apocalyptic setting of present-day Hebron, there does become a bit of a moral turning point in that story, which is probably maybe not 1947, but certainly is after 1967, where you talk in detail about the kind of, I have to say, I find an insight that I felt I was learning from this book is that romanticism and extremism are so deeply linked in Israel-Palestine, right? So the story of the great return of the settlers in 1967 to Hebron, which was an illegal activity, their stories, they think are romantic stories, but they're actually the incredibly extremist set of behaviors, which really culminates in 1994 with the murder at the Cave of the Patriarchs by Baruch Goldstein, who is still celebrated and seen as a hero. So is that, when does the turning point of the story to become a place that is not just the birth of this conflict, but a kind of bleak signal about where the conflict has become? Where does that happen for you in the arc of the story?
So I think that happened for me in 1980. Until then, the settlement movement had not succeeded in convincing the government to allow them to rebuild the Jewish community of Hebron. Until then, the closest they'd gotten was Kiryat Arba. So Kiryat Arba was established in response to a terror attack committed in Hebron, established in around 1970. But that was only kind of like the government throwing a bone to the settlement movement in the hope that they would stop trying to rebuild the Jewish community in Hebron, the Jewish quarter of Hebron. But what led the government to finally give in to those demands was an attack by a man who is now the mayor of Hebron that killed 6 Jews in Hebron who were going from Marat Machpelah, the Tomb of the Patriarchs, to visit these women and children who had been squatting in this historic building, Beit Hadassah in Hebron, for about a year. They had been living there in the hope of convincing the government to allow Jews to rebuild the Jewish quarter of Hebron. And it was that terror attack that finally led the government to say yes. And that has been kind of this formula of
Can I actually
settlement building.
I think my favorite paragraph in the book says exactly this. When you write, this series of events between 1967 and 1970, so 10 years before this, would become a pattern. First, pressure on the government by settlers is first met by government refusal. Then attacks by Palestinians place further pressure on the government to stand strong and not submit to terror, lest it be seen as legitimate and effective. The government then approves settlement construction or expansion. The military forces necessary to protect the settlers further entrenches the occupation, placing additional restrictions on Palestinian freedom of movement. Tensions lead to violent interactions between Israeli troops, frustrated Palestinians, and settlers. It's a cycle that continues to this day. That's it.
Yeah.
So 1980 is the moment when, so what happens that allows them to move Jews back into Hebron? The result of that particular terror attack?
Yeah. So that terror attack, because of, it was at that time, might sound to us not so bad, which says a lot about our current condition. But in 1980, that was the deadliest terror attack ever to occur in the West Bank under Israeli control. It had been under Israeli control 13 years by then, and that was the deadliest terror attack to take place. And it was mostly yeshiva students who were killed. And it was symbolic because it was a crowd of young people visiting these women and children who had been living in this abandoned, decrepit building, which itself was a symbol of the massacre of 1929, because Beit Hadassah, that building they were squatting in, was the scene of one of the worst atrocities that took place during the massacre. It was Beit Hadassah was this Hadassah clinic run by the Jewish community of Hebron, where they treated free of charge needy Arabs in Hebron. The Arabs in Hebron were the majority, as they are today. So in 1929, there were 20,000 Arabs in Hebron and 800 Jews. Today, there are about 250,000 Arabs in Hebron and about 800 Jews. And what happened in 1929 was that this elderly pharmacist who lived in next door to the Beit Hadassah clinic, he and his family were slaughtered. I'm not going to go into details because it is really horrific what happened to them, but it's in the book. And their campaign to revive the Jewish quarter had been met by government rejection for a year, and finally this terror attack pushed the government's hand, allowed the Jewish community to be rebuilt. Very little. There were just a few buildings that they were allowed to live in at the time. But I think that this is when we start to see the transformation of Hebron into kind of like this military base that it is today, where, the presence of Jews in Hebron necessitates this heavy military presence. And I think this goes back to your question of, I don't hide the fact that this presence of Jews in Hebron creates tremendous oppression for the Palestinian community. And I paint that picture very vividly in the book, from going back to my first visit to Hebron, where I saw this Palestinian girl looking down at me from her home onto a street where I was walking, though I did not live in Israel or Palestine. I was visiting from New York. I could walk on this street that she could not walk on. And her window was covered in iron bars to protect her from stone-throwing settlers. And so in my book, I'm very detailed about the kind of oppression Palestinians in Hebron live under, but I go deep to see why that exists, why it is like that. And I think that you can't just talk about, what we're seeing. If you want to resolve it and see a different reality, you have to understand why that reality exists. And so what happened after 1980, when the Jewish community was rebuilt, they weren't violent from the start. They weren't antagonizing their Palestinian neighbors. It was only after terror attacks against them became a regular occurrence that their presence necessitated this heavy military presence to protect them. And so, like I wrote in the book, this tension and any kind of restrictive measures that were placed on the Palestinians then, added more tension. And so, I don't think that a Jewish presence in Hebron should necessitate such a heavy military presence. I don't think that Palestinians should need to have their movement restricted in Hebron. I don't think they should not be allowed to walk on streets in the city where they live. But for that to change, you have to have the end of this terror campaign that results in near daily terror attacks, not just on Hebron, but across the West Bank. And, that reality has existed basically since 1980.
Mm-hmm. And now it's even less likely to ever happen because of the way in which some of the characters in the book, who early on in the history of the settlement movement are considered completely marginal to Israeli society, and now they are literally in the Netanyahu government.
Exactly.
So the government is beholden to those forces, thus eliminating any possibility of marginalizing them again.
Right. And the oppression that I saw in Hebron and the West Bank has only, gotten worse. I mean, the displacement of Palestinians from lands in the West Bank has only increased since October 7th, and incidents of masked settlers going and firebombing Palestinian towns, all of that has gotten worse. And we'll only see an end to that if we see an end to this cycle.
Yeah. You pay a lot of attention in the book because it's in many ways, it's about extremism, fundamentalism, and the misuse of religion, and because it's Hebron, right? Which I think to this day is still the most religious Palestinian city, right? Ramallah is on one extreme and Hebron is on the other extreme. But you pay really close attention to religion at the heart of this conflict. And one of the critiques actually for a long time of the way in which the peace process was adjudicated for years was a kind of sidelining of religion, treating these as national political conflicts between the Israeli people and the Palestinian people, and that the religious stuff will sort itself out. Those who believe that this conflict is really about religion, those are the people who will not ever be deterritorialized. They're going to grip very hard onto the land. It reminds me of in Fukuyama's End of History in 1990, he describes like the liberal order will forever abide, right? That's his argument basically following the end of the Cold War. And he says in passing, it's like an amazing piece of history to look at. He says, there are two things that might get in the way of the liberal order eventually. One is religion and one is nationalism. But don't worry, we're resilient enough to defeat them. And you're like, you knew exactly what the problems were. You just thought that you were better than them. So I would love to hear you reflect a little bit about what you learned about religion in this conflict and whether that critique of the peace process holds to you. And also, maybe this is a really pessimistic question, whether if this is ultimately about two religious faiths that make it most difficult, and because religion does not tolerate compromise the same way that secularity does, whether this is actually just a very dark window into something that maybe can't really be solved?
Easy question.
I know. Well,
Come on, give me something harder. So I think that it's very obvious that the peace process has completely ignored the role that religion plays in perpetuating this conflict. And I think that the fact that Hebron is the most religious Palestinian city and produces the highest number of terrorists and, one of the biggest centers of Hamas's popularity in the West Bank tells you what the role of Islam, particularly radical Islam, is in fueling this conflict and driving it. And of course, of actors like the Religious Zionist Party, Otzma Yehudit, the Jewish Power Party. Again, these are extremes. I mean, within Israeli society, parties like Otzma Yehudit would have garnered maybe 1% of the vote if it wasn't for Netanyahu's effort to stay in power and bring that party into the fold. But, in Palestinian society, that's not the case. The extremist elements hold a lot of sway, which is how, of course, Hamas came to power in Gaza and has held on to power. But I think that, we're seeing now in this war that Palestinians who are not members of Hamas understand that this perpetual struggle and resistance has gotten them nowhere. And, we know from polls and Hamas's efforts to change those polls that they don't actually have as much support as they would like us to think. And I think that if the West and other players working towards peace recognized the role of religion and acted to elevate moderate peace-seeking Palestinians and put even just a fraction of their resources into elevating those voices who are so marginalized, not just marginalized, I mean, they cannot speak out freely without fearing for their lives. I think if those people didn't have to fear for their lives and could speak out and could be the voices of a future generation of Palestinian leadership and didn't have to flee the country in order to speak out, as we see with, the voices that we are seeing, on Twitter and other spaces, I don't think we would be where we are today in this conflict. I think we would have been able to reach a peaceful resolution if there had been more of an effort to empower those peace-seeking moderates within Palestinian society, because the idea that you could just force both sides into negotiations that would lead to a pretty good end, but then have the Palestinian side just reject out of hand, offering no alternative to that offer, that has not worked. And yet no other form of negotiation has been put forward because I think Western leaders have been lazy, and I think that it's really difficult to address the role religion plays. And I think also Westerners, and not just Western leaders, but Western people in general, have a hard time wrapping their heads around the idea that religion is fueling death and destruction in the 21st century. Because, the Crusades ended 1,000 years ago. I mean, people don't really kill for religion in the Western world anymore, at least, not on such a large scale as they do in the Middle East. And so I think that it's just easier for them to understand, and if they just kind of sideline the role of religion. And I really hope that changes. Yeah. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is to force people to recognize that the real drivers of this conflict have been ignored at all of our peril.
So let's talk a little bit about October 7th, because the book is visibly transformed by it. October 7th now courses throughout this book. I'm going to express empathy for your editor. I'm sure that was a complicated sequence of events, because I imagine this book was well underway prior to... Yeah.
She was there in Israel.
You were in Israel, right. So to see a book that is not about a particular historical moment and then become about this historical moment, I'm curious about a little bit of the process of how much did you go back and say, I need to do this thing differently? Or how much did you feel like, wait, this is just validation of my thesis. All I need to do is, connect the dots between the past and the present.
It was a little bit of both, to be honest. The book was about halfway done. I was, I think, halfway through my manuscript. My deadline for submitting the manuscript was April of 2024. And the book was supposed to be published in, late 2025? And it was only after October 7th that I was informed that that was moving up about a year. And I somehow managed to still meet my deadline, but I had to just kind of get rid of entire chapters that I had written because I now needed to make room for new chapters about October 7th. And it was pretty clear immediately after October 7th that the premise of the book really needed to be more about, the parallels and what they tell us. And I mean, I had probably the most complete part of the book was the part about 1929. So all of that was done. And so, that kind of made October 7th all the more haunting for me because I had spent so much time reading and writing about this massacre that seemed to be playing out on repeat before my eyes on October 7th. And so after that, I went back to reporting, and I reported on the hostage crisis, interviewed many hostage family members and people who had lost loved ones on October 7th, and that reporting ended up becoming part of the book.
You asked me when first came in whether I had to skip over the very, very extensive section when you're writing about the massacre in 1929, where you go into incredibly gruesome detail about the violence in Hebron in 1929. There's photographs in the book from some of the victims. I'm curious if that's been a common reception in the book, that people feel, having now seen October 7th up close, that they can't read these stories in the past in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually heard that more on the part of people reading the October 7th section. So that was actually what I was asking you, if you had to skip that section about October 7th. But yeah, Claire, my editor, told me, she said I had to tone down some of the details I included from 1929. So as horrific as it is, there is much more. There are many more horrific details that were not included in the book about 1929. And, the family member in Memphis who gave me David's letters, for her, it was really painful to read the details of the massacre in 1929, especially since her own uncle had suffered those atrocities. It was really difficult writing about them. I mean, in 2019, when I began writing about the book, and then in 2020, when I was starting to write about the massacre and starting to write those chapters, I was pregnant with my first child. And I remember many times thinking, what am I doing? Why am I writing this book? This is so depressing. And many times before October 7th, I had wanted, I don't think I ever told you that, Claire, that I had wanted to maybe not write this book. But October 7th really changed that. I never second guessed after October 7th that I wanted to write this book and that I had to write this book. And the idea of going into very detailed descriptions of what happened in 1929 and on October 7th were as a result of this massive widespread denial of the facts of October 7th and the victim blaming that followed both massacres that convinced me, no, I need to include these details even if it is really difficult to read them.
I'll ask you one last question and then happy to hear some questions from the crowd. But I'm curious about the reception of the book following October 7th, given the media climate around Israel, given the total partisanship in this conversation, given the fact that if it was hard enough beforehand to compete in a landscape of competing narratives, now everything is assumed to be, partisan on one side or another, and you're trying to put forth some real history and real reporting about this conflict in the middle of this moment, not to mention the fact that anyone who has an Israeli name is having a hard time getting things published. So can you talk a little bit about what it's like to have this book out in the world right now?
So it began before the book was even purchased by a publisher. When I was shopping around the proposal, my agent, who is not Jewish, not Israeli, has no connection to this conflict, he loved the proposal and thought that every publisher would be interested in publishing it. He thought I would get $1 million contract. And it took, I think, 1 or 2 years to find a publisher who was interested in the book, despite the fact that it is, it's not a book based on my opinion. It is completely fact-based. Despite my credentials in journalism, the idea of revealing these inconvenient truths was not something that anyone was brave enough to take on. And I've seen that since the book came out, in the fact that so many of the reviews and the coverage that my book has gotten have been in the Jewish world. So the only non-Jewish publication or podcasts that have covered the book were the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg's Business Week podcast. Everything else, I'm very grateful for the coverage the book has gotten. I was just on Elon Levy's State of a Nation podcast. The book was reviewed in, Jerusalem Post, Times of Israel, you name it. But I don't think that would be the case if this book was written from the opposing perspective. You can see that in the, not comparing myself to Ta-Nehisi Coates, Pulitzer Prize-winning journals, but, his book has...
You actually did do research on the issue.
Exactly. I didn't go on a 10-day trip to Israel, Palestine. I lived there for 10 years, and this book is a result of that. So, that says it all, that his book has been on every news outlet you can think of, and we thought it would be pretty easy to get this book on NPR or, I worked at NBC News and MSNBC, wrote for Time Magazine, the New York Times. I thought there would be something, not all of them, of course. I didn't, I was realistic, but I really didn't expect that, especially since it is pretty even-handed. I go into detail about the way Palestinians live in Hebron and how depressing the reality in Hebron is. And, I don't hide those facts, and I think that it says so much about the state of journalism today and the literary world that even something this even-handed and this message of peace, really. I think this book really can be read as a message of peace and hope, because I'm very clear that this isn't a problem of all Palestinian people rejecting peace. It's about corrupt leaders refusing peace for their own benefit, for their own interests. And so I hope that changes. I'm also very realistic about the state of the world right now, but I do, of course, hope that changes.
Yardena, I want to thank you on three fronts. First of all, for this event tonight. These are hard topics to talk about, hard conversations about a hard issue. And I'm grateful that you're here. I want to thank you for being part of the Hartman Network and the Hartman community. I'm so grateful to have met you through the context of this fellowship program that I hope it can continue. And most importantly, I get a lot of questions all the time of what are some books I can read to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And to be honest, there's not a lot of good ones. And you have really raised the bar with this book. You've put something into not only our community, but into the public discourse that hopefully should be read on all sides of political aisles to do exactly what you're asking us to do, which is to pause in the present and really try to deeply understand the past, not so that you get stuck in it, not so we litigate old fights, but that we can actually understand and move past the present. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Yardena for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to our show, and special thanks to our guest this week, Yardena Schwartz. You can find her book, Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict, at the link in the episode description. Identity Crisis is produced by me, Tessa Zitter, and our executive producer is Maytal Friedman. This episode was produced with assistance from Annie Beyer-Chaffetz, recorded by Next Millennium Productions, and edited by Gareth Hobbs at Silversound NYC, with music provided by So Called. Transcripts of our show are now available on our website, typically a week after an episode airs. We're always looking for ideas for what we should cover in future episodes, so if you have a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you have comments about this episode, please write to us at identitycrisis@shalomhartman.org. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes and subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. See you next time, and thanks for listening.